I was cutting the pie when Marcus said it, 7 slices, one for each person at the table, and I remember the knife stopping halfway through the crust because of what came out of his mouth. We had Richard Coleman over that night, Marcus's boss, a broad, silver-haired man who ran the regional division Marcus had spent 6 years trying to climb inside of. The house smelled like rosemary, and the candles I'd bought that afternoon on the way home from the office, the kind of ordinary Tuesday evening where nothing was supposed to happen except dinner and small talk and the low hum of a marriage doing what marriages do. I had closed the Halloran account that week, the biggest retainer our firm had signed in 3 years, the kind of win that gets your name mentioned in a partners meeting whether you're in the room or not. Richard had raised his glass to me not 2 minutes earlier. To Elena, he'd said, smiling, the woman who apparently doesn't know how to lose a client. Everyone laughed. I smiled and said thank you, because that's what you do when a room is being kind to you. Then, Richard turned to Marcus, still smiling, still just making conversation, and said, "You married well." And Marcus, without even looking up from his plate, said, "She got lucky. Right place, right time. Halloran's wife went to college with her. That's the whole story." He said it the way you'd mention the weather. Light, certain. Like it cost him nothing to hand 9 months of my work to chance, like the 42-page risk assessment I'd built from scratch, the 3 sleepless weeks before the pitch, the 2 client dinners I'd sat through, absorbing every objection Halloran's board could throw at me, had simply evaporated into a story about a college roommate's husband. The table went quiet in that particular way. Tables go quiet when everyone has heard something they weren't supposed to hear out loud. Richard's eyebrows moved, just slightly, the small involuntary tell of a man recalculating something. I didn't put the knife down. I didn't raise my voice. I finished cutting the pie, plated the first slice, and set it in front of my husband. "Careful," I said. "It's still hot." Then I served the rest of the table, 1 plate at a time, refilled the water glasses, and asked Richard if he wanted coffee. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just kept my hands steady, and my voice even, and underneath all of it, in the part of me that had spent 14 years being trained to notice when a number didn't add up, something had already started taking notes. My name is Elena Marsh. I was 36 years old that spring, a senior forensic accountant at a firm called Belrose Advisory, where my job was to sit inside a company's numbers until they told me the truth nobody wanted to say out loud. Fraud examination trains you in a specific kind of patience. You don't react to the first inconsistency, you wait, you document, you build a timeline, and you let the pattern reveal itself on its own schedule, because a single anomaly means almost nothing, but 3 of them pointing in the same direction mean everything. I had built an entire career on not flinching, on sitting very still across a table from someone who was lying to me and letting my silence do more work than my questions ever could. I had never once imagined I would need that particular skill inside my own house. I had grown up believing that competence spoke for itself, that if you did careful, honest work, credit would eventually find you without you having to go looking for it. My mother used to say that showing off was for people who didn't trust their own results. I carried that belief into my marriage, the way you carry an old coat you've stopped noticing the weight of, comfortable, familiar, and heavier than you'd admit if someone asked you to take it off and hold it in your hands. I thought Marcus believed the same thing. That night, cutting the pie, I learned he had simply been quiet, for years, about believing something else entirely. Marcus and I met 9 years earlier, at a conference in Denver, both of us junior, both of us hungry in the ordinary way, 20-something professionals are hungry. He was easy to like, funny in meetings, generous with his time, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order after a single conversation and brought it up 2 weeks later like it meant something, which, at the time, it did. We married 2 years after that. In a small ceremony his mother helped plan down to the last centerpiece, and within the first 18 months I had already made the first of several quiet trades, though I didn't have language for it yet. His firm offered him a regional manager position that required relocating to Ohio. Mine did not have an office there. I left a role I'd spent 4 years building toward a partner track for, took a lateral position at a smaller firm in Columbus, and told myself it was temporary, the kind of sacrifice a good marriage asks of you sometimes, evenly, in both directions, over time. That's what I believed, that it would even out. It didn't come back around in both directions. 3 years later, when a director position opened at my new firm, Marcus asked me, gently, over dinner, whether I really wanted the stress of it, whether it made sense given how much travel his own role was demanding that year, whether we might want to wait until things settled for him before I took something else on. I turned the promotion down. I told myself I was being a good partner, that timing mattered, that ambition could wait a year without costing me anything real. I did not clock, at the time, how many conversations like that one there had already been, or notice that every single one of them had somehow resolved in the same direction, like a river that only ever seemed to bend toward his side of the bank. His mother Diane was a constant, warm presence in those years, the kind of mother-in-law who remembered your allergies, sent handwritten cards for no occasion at all, and called just to ask how your week had gone. She used to tell me, at every holiday dinner, how proud she was that Marcus had found someone so accomplished, someone so capable. She said it so often, in fact, that it eventually stopped sounding like a compliment and started sounding like something she was rehearsing for an audience only she could see. There was one Thanksgiving, maybe 5 years into the marriage, when I mentioned offhand that I'd been asked to speak on a panel at a regional conference, and Diane clapped her hands together and said, "Look at you," in a voice that carried just slightly too much surprise in it to be purely warm. I remember Marcus laughing along beside her, a small, easy laugh, the kind you don't think twice about at the time, and only recognize later as part of a much longer pattern once you know what you're looking for. I loved Diane. I want to be honest about that before I tell you the rest of this story, because admiration and envy wear the same face, and it took me the better part of 9 years to learn how to tell them apart on her. The night of the dinner, after Richard and the rest of our guests had gone home, and the house had gone quiet except for the dishwasher running in the kitchen, I did not confront Marcus. I have a rule, one I use constantly in my work, and had apparently, without ever deciding to, carried into my marriage as well. Gather everything before they know you've seen it. Confrontation without evidence is just an argument, and arguments get explained away by the end of the same conversation that started them. So I told Marcus I was tired, kissed him on the cheek, and went upstairs to the spare room we used as an office. I did not sleep. I sat down at the small desk by the window and opened our joint banking portal the way I might open a client's ledger on a Monday morning. Methodically, without emotion, just numbers on a screen waiting to be read correctly. At first I told myself I was only looking for reassurance, something ordinary that would let me feel foolish in the morning for staying up so late over one careless sentence at a dinner table. What I found instead, an hour and 40 minutes in, was a second checking account, opened 14 months earlier under an address I didn't recognize, funded by small, regular transfers from Marcus's paycheck that never once touched our joint expenses. Not large amounts, careful amounts. $90 one week, $120 the next. Never enough on its own to trip an alert on our joint statement. Never patterned closely enough together to look like anything but ordinary spending if you weren't specifically trained to notice ordinary spending, arranged with intention. The kind of numbers designed to sit quietly under the radar of a wife who trusted her husband enough not to go looking. I remember staring at the account opening date for a long time, doing the math automatically, the way I do with any client engagement, and realizing it was 9 days after I'd been officially notified about the Halloran retainer. I closed the laptop that first night around 3 in the morning and sat in the dark for a while, listening to Marcus breathing evenly in the next room, completely unaware that the version of our marriage he thought he'd been managing had just quietly ended without him in it. I remember thinking, almost clinically, that this was the exact feeling I tried to describe to junior analysts on my team. The moment a case stops being a hypothesis and becomes a fact, you now have to build a structure around. There's no drama in that moment. There's just a very quiet click somewhere behind your ribs, and then the work begins. I spent the next 3 weeks the way I spend the first 3 weeks of any case at work, quietly, methodically, saying nothing to anyone, including him. I pulled 6 months of statements. I cross-referenced dates against Marcus's travel calendar and his expense reports, which, as it turned out, I still had partial access to through an old shared drive from years earlier when I'd helped him set up his filing system. I found a pattern of charges at a hotel 40 minutes outside the city, always on Thursday evenings, always the same room rate, spanning a period that started almost exactly when the second account had first appeared. People who believe they will never get caught leave the messiest trails, because carefulness is exhausting to sustain over time. And sooner or later, everyone gets lazy in precisely the place they assumed no one was ever going to look. But 3 weeks in, going back through old files to build a complete timeline, I found something that didn't fit the story I thought I was assembling. Buried in a folder of tax documents from 6 years earlier, mislabeled and mostly forgotten, I found an email chain I had never seen before. It was between Marcus and the managing partner of my old firm in Chicago, dated the same month I had been shortlisted for that first partner track promotion, the one we'd left behind entirely when we moved to Ohio for his job. In it, Marcus had written that he didn't believe I was, in his words, ready for that level of visibility yet, and that he'd appreciate it if the firm considered giving the opportunity to someone with, quote, steadier footing instead. My hands were completely steady while I read it, which surprised me more than the email itself did. I have handled enough fraud cases to know that the body often reacts before the mind catches up. A tightness in the jaw, a coldness in the fingers. But I felt none of it that night. I think some part of me had already been expecting to find something like this for years, without ever letting myself name the shape of it. I printed the email, dated it, and filed it in a folder I had started keeping in the bottom drawer of my desk at the office. A folder I had begun labeling, half as a joke to myself at first, Halloran, backup documentation, because no one at Belrose would think twice about opening that. I read the dates twice, certain I was misunderstanding something. I wasn't. He had sent that email 3 days before I was told, gently, and with what I believed at the time was genuine regret from the partners, that the position had gone to someone else. And 11 days before he first sat me down and suggested, so reasonably, that we should think seriously about Ohio, I remembered that conversation with a clarity that surprised me, sitting there years later with the proof of it glowing on my screen. He had made me a cup of tea I hadn't asked for, and set it down in front of me before he brought up Ohio, a small kindness I had, at the time, taken as evidence of how much he cared about softening a hard conversation for my sake. I understood now that it had simply been good technique. You don't deliver unwelcome news to someone empty-handed if you want them to remember the gesture instead of the outcome. I have used variations of that same instinct myself, professionally, when I have to walk a client through a finding they don't want to hear. It is a strange thing to recognize your husband's manipulation and your own professional training as two branches of the same tree. I sat with that discovery for a long time, alone at that same small desk, the numbers on the screen no longer feeling like numbers at all. It reframed 9 years of my own private explanations for myself, that I hadn't been ready, that the timing had simply never lined up in my favor, that ambition was something I had chosen, on my own, to quietly set down for the sake of a life we were building together. None of that had been entirely true. Someone had been quietly setting it down for me, one small email, one small conversation at a time, and calling it love the whole way through. The deeper twist, the one that finally made sense of all of it, came from a place I did not expect at all. Diane called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice unsteady in a way I had genuinely never heard from her in 9 years, and asked if she could come by that evening, just the two of us. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table Richard had sat at weeks earlier, the same table where the pie had gone cold, and told me she needed to say something before she lost whatever nerve had brought her there. She said that 30 years ago, before I ever knew her, she had been the one with the career, a regional sales director, the primary earner in her marriage to Marcus's father, back when that kind of thing still raised eyebrows at the dinner parties they used to host. She said her husband had spent most of that marriage quietly, patiently undermining her, telling colleagues at company functions that she'd simply been in the right place at the right time, calling her success luck, in exactly the tone Marcus had used at my own table, until eventually she believed it herself and let the job go entirely, telling everyone, including herself, that it had been her own decision. She said she had watched Marcus grow up inside that house, absorbing a lesson none of them had ever meant to teach him out loud, that a man who wants to keep a marriage intact has to keep it just slightly uneven, tipped a little in his own favor, or risk losing something he couldn't quite name. She said that when she first saw how quickly I was rising at Belrose, she recognized the shape of what might happen to me before Marcus himself had even consciously decided to make it happen. And instead of warning me, she had done the opposite. She had quietly coached her son, told him it was normal to manage a wife's confidence a little, the way you'd manage a budget. Told him that competition inside a marriage curdles it if you let it run too far unchecked. She confessed all of it with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup she never once drank from, and she said she was telling me now, finally, because she couldn't watch this happen to another woman and stay silent about it a second time in her life. I called her ex-husband's former assistant the following week, an elderly woman named Patricia who still lived 2 towns over, and, remarkably, remembered the whole thing without needing much prompting, because verification is a habit I genuinely don't know how to switch off, in my marriage or anywhere else. Patricia confirmed it without hesitation. She remembered Diane's resignation letter, arriving out of nowhere. She remembered thinking, at the time, that it made no sense at all, given how well the numbers had been going that quarter. She even remembered a specific detail I hadn't asked about, that in the weeks before Diane resigned, her husband had started inviting colleagues over for dinner and steering every conversation toward how supportive he was of Diane's career, the exact way people announce a virtue right before they quietly take it away from someone. Patricia said she'd always assumed Diane simply burned out, the way people do. She said it was strange, all these years later, to learn it had been built rather than chosen. It matched, cleanly, every detail Diane had given me. And the blame I had quietly carried for 9 years, the private sense that I simply hadn't wanted my own success badly enough to hold on to it, was never mine to carry in the first place. It had been built for me, piece by piece, by a man who had learned exactly how to build it, from watching his own father do it first. The reveal happened at Diane's insistence, at a family dinner 3 weeks later that I did not orchestrate and had almost decided not to attend at all. My friend Grace, who works alongside me at Belrose and came as my +1 that night, told me about it afterward, in more detail than I'd technically asked for, because she said I deserved to hear exactly how it had looked from the outside. Diane stood up midway through the meal, in front of Marcus's father, his sister, and 2 cousins visiting from out of state, and said she needed everyone at that table to know what she had done years ago, and what her son had gone on to continue. Grace said Marcus's face went the exact color of the tablecloth. His father set his fork down slowly and never picked it back up for the rest of the meal. His sister asked, twice, in a voice that kept climbing, whether this was some kind of joke, and nobody at the table answered her either time. Richard Coleman, it turned out, had also been invited that particular night. Marcus had brought him along weeks earlier to keep building the relationship, a detail I found almost funny once I'd had time to sit with it, and Grace said Richard's expression moved slowly from confusion to something closer to quiet embarrassment on Marcus's behalf, the specific embarrassment of a boss realizing he has now applauded the wrong person at the same dinner table twice. Grace said that after Diane finished speaking, the room stayed silent for what felt like a full minute before Marcus's father finally asked her, quietly, why she had never told him any of this in 30 years of marriage. Diane's answer, according to Grace, was simple. She said she hadn't had the words for it back then, only the shame, and that watching it happen again, to someone she genuinely loved, had finally given her the words. Marcus tried twice to speak, and both times his sister told him, flatly, to sit back down. I met Marcus 2 days after that, back at our house, on my own terms and in my own time, with the lawyer's paperwork already sitting in a folder in my car outside. He tried to explain it the way people always try to explain the things they've had weeks to quietly prepare a version of. He said he hadn't meant for any of it to become a pattern. He said his mother's advice had felt reasonable in the moment, years ago, small and harmless, the kind of thing you don't examine too closely, because examining it would mean admitting what it actually was. He said he loved me. He said he wanted a real chance to be someone better than what he'd learned growing up. I let him finish every sentence of it. Then I told him that I understood exactly where it had come from now, and that understanding where something comes from does not obligate you to keep living inside it. I can see why you did it, I said. That's different from forgiving it, and it's very different from staying. He reached across the table for my hand at one point, the way he used to when we were first married, and an argument was about to end in an apology instead of a resolution, and I let him take it for a moment before I gently pulled it back. It wasn't cruelty, it was just that I finally understood the difference between comfort and closure, and I no longer wanted to confuse the two. He asked, quietly, what that meant for us going forward. I told him it meant I had already called a lawyer the same week I found the hotel charges, before I even knew about the sabotaged promotion or his mother's confession, because some decisions don't actually need every last piece of evidence in hand to become final. They only need enough. The divorce settlement took 4 months and stayed fair the entire way through, because I made certain of that myself, going through every joint account with the same careful detachment I'd bring to any client's ledger at work. I didn't ask for more than what was legitimately mine. I didn't need the paperwork to punish him. The truth, once it was fully assembled, had already done that on its own. He asked me once, near the very end, sitting across from a mediator's conference table, whether there was any chance at all we might try again once things had properly settled. I told him no, the way you close a file you've finally finished reading all the way through, quietly, without needing to go back and reread the last page to already know exactly how the story ends. It's been a 1.5 years now. I left Belrose Advisory 8 months ago to start my own practice, a small forensic accounting firm that works almost exclusively with women rebuilding their finances after a divorce, a failed business partnership, or a marriage where the numbers, it turns out, were never quite as joint as they'd been told they were. I named the firm after my grandmother, who used to say that the truth doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. It only needs someone patient enough to go looking for it, and honest enough to keep looking even after the first answer they find is uncomfortable. Diane and I still speak. Not often, but far more honestly than we ever managed to in 9 years of holiday dinners. She sends a card at Christmas, plain and short, and I still keep every one of them in the same drawer. Last month, one of my new clients, a woman in her 50s starting over after a 30-year marriage, sat across from me and said something I recognized instantly, the same sentence in almost the same words, that she supposed she just hadn't wanted her career badly enough to hold on to it. I told her what I wish someone had told me 9 years earlier, that wanting something badly enough has very little to do with whether the people around you are quietly working to make sure you don't get it. She cried for the first time in our 3 meetings together, and then she asked to see the numbers, all of them, from the beginning. That's usually where the real work starts. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't making someone suffer for what they did to you. It's simply refusing to carry the story they wrote about you for one single day longer than you have to. If you'd been sitting at that table the night Marcus called it luck, I want to know honestly, would you have kept cutting the pie, or would you have set the knife down right there in front of everyone? Tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight, and if you want more stories like Elena's, stay close and hit subscribe, because this is only one of many.